6,000 years before the present, the colossal city of Uruk, by far the largest in the world, dominated the southern Mesopotamian plains of modern-day Iraq. With a population of at least 50,000 people, Uruk wouldn't be surpassed in size or in numbers for an astonishing 3,000 years to come, until well into the Classical Age. The legendary homeland of Gilgamesh, a colossal mud brick wall said to have been erected by the great hero king himself, once enclosed the city's impressive 6-kilometer radius. Yet, impressive as it was, Uruk didn't exist in a vacuum. The city was simply the latest, albeit most successful, in a long line of similar experiments in living, dating all the way back to the Stone Age. More than 5,000 years before the founding of Uruk, other, smaller, though no less impressive settlements had begun to coalesce and form in this region of the world. The very first known examples of static, communal living in history. In other words, though the exact definition varies, the first cities on Earth. The most well-known of these settlements, perhaps due to its often cited links to the biblical walls of Jericho of the Old Testament, remains arguably the most impressive of all. Jericho is a place of firsts. Here, 5,000 years before Uruk, can be found the first known settlement in history to be surrounded by walls. Some of the earliest evidence of cooperation between a group larger than a single clan or kinship. The first significant evidence of large-scale communal labour. And, when it was first discovered, the first tower, complete with walled steps, in history. What makes this especially striking is that besides a scattering of mysterious pictographic symbols, writing wouldn't develop for thousands of years to come. Even pottery didn't exist yet, though, nevertheless, these people still came together here all those millennia ago and achieved something astonishing. We don't know where they came from. We don't know their ethnicity. We don't know who their gods were. But we do know this may be one of the first places on Earth where animals were domesticated and agriculture experimented with on a wide scale. All of this was achieved an astonishing 11,000 years before the present, just a few centuries after the end of the last ice age, a time when woolly mammoths still walked the earth. What makes Jericho all the more fascinating is that, unlike other sites such as Uruk, which always rested upon fragile ecological roots and altering river courses, the spring here has never dried up, meaning people still live here today. This is the story of Jericho, one of the oldest cities on Earth. In January 1951, an airplane touched down in the Middle East. On board sat one of the rising stars of archaeology, an academic discipline then undergoing a renaissance of new scientific methods, pioneered by such scholars as the Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, as well as a revolution in scholarship ushered in by the implementation of radiocarbon dating, a technique which allowed researchers to accurately date their findings for the first time. unlike archaeologists of the previous generation, perhaps best exemplified by Heinrich Schliemann, the swashbuckling discoverer of Troy, whose methods essentially amounted to bulldozing through ancient cities in search of information, much of which was discovered, though untold more lost forever. This new corps of scholars sought to meticulously uncover sites from the top down, whilst causing as little damage as possible. That archaeologist was Kathleen Kenyon, a student of the famous Sir Mortimer Wheeler and daughter of the director of the British Museum. Kenyon had been called in to the shores of the Dead Sea to investigate a particularly interesting and controversial site. For this wasn't the first time the city of Jericho had been excavated. 20 years earlier, fellow British archaeologist John Garstang had undertaken a 6-year investigation of the site, eventually surmising it to be the site of the famed walls from the Old Testament, destroyed by the Israelite Joshua with a trumpet. Though still associated with this story today, Garstang's conclusions received fairly heavy criticism, and finally, by 1951, with the chaos of the Second World War somewhat subsided, Kenyon had been called in to make her own conclusions. Unlike other archaeological sites throughout the region, often sited out in the desert due to changing river courses, or even underwater due to rising sea levels, the geography of Jericho has changed little since the last ice age. Sitting comfortably between two mountain ranges and the Dead Sea, it not only rests in a naturally defensible location, but underground water supplies have fed the oasis here for as long as humans have lived in the region. A thriving town, modern Jericho stretches over an area of some 15 kilometres, encompassing lush fields and orchards in a seemingly barren landscape due to the abundant underground water supplies. The actual work, however, was to be done at a solitary mound rising up over the settlement on one edge of town, known today as Tel Es Sultan. On first glance, Tel Es Sultan might have appeared to be a naturally occurring hill, especially before archaeological work had been carried out. Yet, in actuality, it is so much more. The hill itself is far from natural. Like all tells, it is actually the result of thousands of years of collapsed mud brick architecture. A mountain of the debris of previous cities, which collapsed, were levelled and eventually built over by successive generations down over the long millennia. As she approached the site, Kenyon knew that it was old. But just how old, she, nor anyone else, had any idea. The techniques Kenyon and her colleagues used are known as stratigraphic excavation, meticulously noting soil layers as they dug, in order to date the various layers of habitation and get an accurate sequence of events. After some initial digging work and a re-evaluation of Garstang's conclusions, Kenyon decided there simply wasn't enough evidence to conclusively make the biblical connection. As often happens with archaeology, more digging was needed, and Kenyon called in for backup. In the next year, a small army of labourers arrived at the site and work began. They wouldn't be finished until 1958, some 6 years later, by which time Jericho had become one of the most famous archaeological sites in history. John Garstang had initially dated the earliest settlements on the site to the 4th millennium BC, As far as most scholars at the time were concerned, the widespread domestication of agriculture and animals had only occurred around 1,000 years or so earlier. What Kenyon and her team found would change everything. Habitation had in fact continued at the site for an astonishing 8,000 years, between around 9,400 and 1580 BC, with the potential for even earlier habitation too. Though this end date was later amended to around 1400 BC and is still debated by scholars today, it doesn't change the overall implications of Kenyon's findings. Perhaps the most astonishing and iconic of the buildings discovered turned out not to be Garstang's walls, but a Neolithic tower which was built so much earlier, around 10,000 years ago. At the time, the earliest ever known on Earth. Today, more than half of the world's population live in cities. But there was once a time when this was far from the case. Up until around 11,000 years ago, the Earth had been locked into a seemingly endless ice age for eons. 25,000 years ago, reaching the coldest point of the last ice age, known as the last glacial maximum. From then on, however, a steady and gradual melt kicked in. Finally, after a brief return to cold conditions, known as the Younger Dryas, which may have in part helped kickstart agriculture out of necessity due to the difficult conditions it ushered in, the entire world returned to its pre-Ice Age warm period. And humans could finally flourish once more. Bands of humans, often called affluent hunter-gatherers in this period, who previously had huddled together for warmth, or simply lived much further south than they do today, found themselves living in a land of plenty. They hunted game, collected wild plants and grasses, and travelled from region to region, living a nomadic existence. By around 9,500 BC, groups of these people began to coalesce at natural springs, oases, and particularly abundant rivers in the wide arc of the Middle East we know today as the Fertile Crescent, due to its abundant food supplies, to either voluntarily or involuntarily due to environmental pressures begin a new experiment in human living. Helped along their way by the uniqueness of the grasses and seeds in this area, some of which could be cultivated and replanted by human hands, rather than simply gathered, and thus give a near inexhaustible food source for the future. Still semi-migratory at first, in time, as wild grasses began to be changed and made more edible by human hands, their descendants would settle down for good, ever experimenting with plants and animals in order to feed their families, a necessity which in time, due to overpopulation and overuse of natural resources, made their domestication both possible and necessary. One such site was Jericho, then a large oasis in the Jordan Valley. Underground tributaries perpetually flow from that river into the central mountains to the west, making life not only possible here, but incredibly fertile due to the unique low geography of the region, making it closer to the underground water surface. Home to an abundance of wild animals and plants, agriculture may have been harnessed here earlier than most other places on the planet. Though, of course, Jericho didn't exist in isolation. From its earliest days, the oasis lay at the heart of a thriving system of trading communities scattered throughout the Fertile Crescent. though our evidence suggests Jericho was one of the largest of these. If not the largest, it almost certainly wasn't the earliest, nor the originator of the pre-pottery Neolithic culture which would come to dominate the site, nor farming or pastoralism, for these began elsewhere. In the 1990s, an archaeological discovery was made in modern-day southeastern Turkey that sent shockwaves through multiple academic disciplines. Famous the world over as Göbekli Tepe, perhaps the first religious centre on Earth. This site is actually thought to have been built and used by numerous bands of affluent hunter-gatherers, perhaps sharing a common religion and culture. The strange animal figures all over the pillars here, and even on other neighbouring sites throughout the region, may even be pictographs, a form of primitive hieroglyphics, though their message is yet to be uncovered. As well as fueling the idea that religion, not agriculture, had in fact been the catalyst for the birth of civilization, the site also left tantalizing clues as to the origins of agriculture. For the very oldest known wild relative of wheat is found not too far away. It's not too much of a stretch to think that some of those at Jericho may have had some sort of connection with Göbekli Tepe. Professor Stephen Mithen even thinks it possible that after the ceremonies undertaken here, travellers would go back to their respective tribes with seeds and the secret of how to grow them. Work is still going on at Göbekli Tepe, and we learn more every year. Unfortunately, however, the similarly ancient and fascinating site of Jerf El Akmar, perhaps a similar ceremonial centre for hunter-gatherers, and contemporary with the earliest stages of settlement at Jericho, now lies under a lake, having been flooded in the 20th century to make way for a reservoir. This begs the question whether religion, in fact, was the prime mover in forming the first cities. Perhaps at first beginning as a ceremonial centre like Göbekli Tepe, and eventually, over time, as people gathered, they began to settle down and build a community. It may even be possible that some of the earliest farmers on Earth brought the secrets of their technology, grain, to the shrine here, before passing their secrets on during the festivities to other curious groups of hunter-gatherers, presumably in return for some other resource. In turn, they then could have brought the seed back with them to their homeland, along with other resources, such as obsidian in Jericho's case. Maybe the grain even had a ritualized religious quality about it. We may never know for sure, but what we do know is that by around 9000 BC, vast changes in stone technology and a whole new way of life came to the Fertile Crescent. For this was the Neolithic Revolution, the moment when people first adopted farming, raising animals, and communal living.